Hola, buenos días para todos y para todas.
Hello, good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to have you here today. I'm Ana Catarina Suarez Peña. I'm the Regional Director for Latin America of the Global Food Banking Network. Thank you so much for being here during our virtual session. We're very happy to have the presence of over 100 participants today from 15 countries, and we hope these programs help the incredible job that you're doing in all your countries. So that we can start with our program, it's an honor to introduce our moderators to you, my dear friends, Maria Andrea Trujillo Davila and Alexander Guzman Vasquez, co-directors of the Corporate Governance Study Center of the College of Administration in Colombia. Maria Andrea, Alex, welcome. Ana Catalina, thank you so much for the generous invitation. Thank you for taking us into account in this space. And first of all, I would like to welcome all our guests. We're going to give you a context of what the conversation is going to be about, and we're going to have a conversation. That is what we want. We want to talk about good practices in corporate governance for nonprofit organizations. Give me 1 second. I'm going to give you a few technical indications, a few housekeeping rules. As we said, we're going to have four great speakers from Peru, Argentina, Mexico, Chile. They're all experts in governance for nonprofit organizations. Just like Maria Andrea said, Maria Andrea and Alexander are going to have the Q&A session later on. And after that, we're going to have enough time so that you can ask questions. And I'm going to invite you all to use the chat or the Q&A window boxes on the screen. We're going to try to answer as many questions as we can. And if you want to...
Please click the interpretation button at the bottom of Zoom and select English. María, Alex, quedan en su casa. Gracias.
Maria Andrea, Alex, go ahead. Now we're going to get started. We're going to have a very brief introduction of our guest speakers today. This is a Latin American session. We have different people from different countries. First of all, I'm going to introduce Claudia Drago from Lima, Peru. She is the general manager of Mitsui Auto Finance. She is a professor in corporate governance and corporate communications in the Peruvian University of Applied Sciences, UPC. She is an expert and she has worked for 21 years in the Granny Montero Group, where she was in charge of the legal advisory issues and matters. And she was also a member of the board and she was a trade representative. She is an expert in corporate governance and enforcement, both in Peru and Colombia. She has been invited to teach at the MBA class. She has graduated from the University of Lima. She specializes in finance and corporate governance, and she has a recent master's in communications from the UPC also. Thank you. Welcome, Claudia. Thank you so much for being with us. And now it's our pleasure to introduce to you Magdalena Rego. She is here from Chile. She is Corporate Governance Officer for Latin America and the Caribbean for the IFC, the World Bank Group, where she coordinates all regional efforts and the training for members of boards of directors at the highest level. She represents Latin America in the different global practices groups. She has worked as a regional manager for the Siemens Corporation, a German company. She presents internationally about corporate government, sustainability. She has also been an associated professor for the MBA. She graduated with an MBA in the Catholic University in Chile, and she has postgraduate studies in Columbia School. Magdalena, welcome also. And then we also have with us Dr. Alda Roxana Cárdenas from Mexico. She is emeritus professor of the Technological Institute of Monterrey. And she is a consultant in organizational participation in public sectors, private sectors. She has been a member of several boards of directors and civil society organizations, and she has worked for the state of Nuevo León in Mexico since 2006 and 2019. She worked officially in the office of the President of the Republic of Mexico. She has a doctorate in the UK. And Roxana, welcome again. And finally, we have Santiago Schacher from Argentina. Santiago is managing director of the Cepheidas Group, and he is co-director of the Corporate Governance Institute of the University of San Andres. He is an expert of the International Finance Corporation (IFC) and the World Bank. He is also a consultant for the OCDE, CAP, BID, and others. He is a professor in the University of San Andres, the University of Century 21, the Argentine Institute of Capital Markets, and he's a member of the board of directors of the Foundation for Leadership, and he is a lawyer. He graduated with a master's in law, international finances, and law in the London Schools of Economics. He has been part of postgraduate programs in Stanford University in California, Berkeley, and the National Association of Corporate Directors. Santiago, welcome. Thank you. So, as you can tell, we have a very special guest today. They're all experts in corporate governance, and we're going to have a very profound conversation today. And just to give you a little bit of context of why we're here today, what we're going to be discussing today about corporate governance, we know that nonprofit corporations are crucial in our countries because they serve needs that the state is not able to cover or the private sector is not able to cover. So it's a third sector that is fundamental in countries such as ours in Latin America, where there is a concentration of assets in the hands of very few. And so we suffer from extreme poverty among our population. So the question is, well, the presentations will be about corporate governance. What does this have to do? I mean, this is corporations. This is like a different world. But what happens is the origin of the work that we're doing nowadays for different types of organizations, they're based on conversations that we have in these different companies about corporate governance. And we look at what the for-profit world is doing, but what we're looking for when we discuss corporate governance, we want to mitigate conflicts of interest. We want to have aligned our interests. We want to have enough resources. We want to guarantee sustainability. And for nonprofit organizations that find it so hard to find the resources and they're fighting to really fulfill their social goals and the reason they were created, so their board members and their boards are not just facing financial problems, but they're also facing the need to establish good governance practices that will allow them to remain sustainable. And this is basic for nonprofit societies. And that's why we're here today. And we really hope for this conversation to be very useful for all of you. Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have 3 rounds of questions and answers, and we're going to discuss in depth what corporate governance is and in the context of nonprofit organizations. So we're going to start with Santiago. Santiago, given the context that we just discussed, we would like for you to give us a very simple definition, very basic, of what we consider corporate governance, and but going beyond the large corporations, any type of corporation, any kind of institution, and what are the main components of this corporate governance?
Thank you very much, Maria Andrea. Alexander, it's a pleasure to be here with you again. I want to thank the Global Food Banking Network for the invitation. And again, it's a pleasure to be here with colleagues like Claudia, Maggie, Roxana, people with whom we work all the time in this environment. I think you gave a pretty good clarification. We always make reference to corporate governance, and corporate, of course, maybe sounds like very serious word when we're talking about nonprofits, but I think it's important to understand that the governance of an organization, it's a way of applying processes, creating structures so that you can direct, you can supervise, oversee the work of that organization. So that's perhaps the most common definition of corporate governance or organizational governance. Now, with my experience, based on that experience working with organizations, I like to define it more as a tool. Each one element is a series of elements that you use in order to see how you control, you direct, you supervise an organization. So one thing I like to emphasize first is that that tool is not the same tool for every organization. You have to keep adapting the tool to the characteristics of the organization that you're working with. The second point is it's a continuous element. You never achieve perfect organizational governance or good organizational governance. You always have to work in that direction. Strategies change, the countries are different, beneficiaries are different, and you need to keep adapting those tools as circumstances evolve also. And perhaps another important point is to understand the cost benefit ratio when you're implementing that tool. We have to understand that cost benefit ratio. You cannot ask for a very heavy, complicated structure to an organization that's going to face a very high cost in trying to implement that structure. So when you think about a tool that's evolving, you have to look at the cost benefit ratio. You have to look at two other features: proportionality and flexibility. The corporate governance needs to be proportional to the organization that it's working with and flexible to adapt as necessary. And this, to conclude answering the question, there's a key point. Corporate governance can be as good as the processes, the documents, the structures you implement, but mostly it's based on the commitments that you have to that uh, corporate governance. I could have perfect policies devised by a consultant but never implement them. So corporate governance requires commitment. And to conclude, there's very significant methodologies to study the importance of corporate governance, the importance also of the governing board, the board of directors, with different names in Mexico, Uruguay, but that name, the corporate board or the board of directors, we will hear them using their own particular terminology. But again, also you need the control environment, the importance it has for stakeholders. For example, when it's a corporate governance, when there is stakeholders, when there is shareholders, and when there's a non-profit is a different thing. So I'm sure we will explore all of those different situations in the next few questions. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Santiago. You mentioned very important elements, the boards of directors, transparency of information, the issue of oversight and control. So we will go into those particular points. Magdalena, we would like for you to tell us a little bit about the importance of that board of directors and the relationship with the with management, with top management, because those boards become the top governance element. And what's the relationship with management? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Magdalena Alexander, for the question. I would like to greet everybody first. It's a great joy for me to be here in this panel with friends, with people who are so committed to this issue, people who have been working in the region for so long. And I want to really thank the FBLI for the invitation and for the great work you've been doing in the region. Now, going straight to the question, why uh, corporate governance is that becomes that main axis. Santiago mentioned about characteristics of corporate governance that can be applied, of course, to nonprofits. So I would like to take a step back and try to remind ourselves how that issue of boards of directors and corporate governance, how that issue emerged, which is the issue of agency. How does the owner make sure that the management is maximizing resources to ensure the highest possible return? So from that conflict, that's or that need, that's where the board of directors emerges with the task of supervisor overseeing management. So there is a flow, there is a relationship that gets established between the corporate government, the board, and the top management and the top managers, depending on the size of the organization, the size and sophistication. It may be just a general management and some officers, or it could be a larger structure. But again, this depends on the size, the development, the sophistication of this nonprofit organization. So the board of directors is there to guide, to supervise, and it's a response to this problem that emerges because we must remember that nonprofits don't have people expecting a return on investment. They don't have shareholders, but they do have donors and people who expect some return, and that return is what requires the organization to work in the best possible way. So to talk in more detail about this flow and the relation between the board that needs to supervise and top management, let me talk about an example. When a financial budget is proposed, first it's proposed to the board approves it, maybe they'll issue some comments, ask for some amendments, and then the management executes that. The board supervises, and that's the flow, the circle of flow that continues throughout the year, and it's being overseen. Now, even though there is a flow, there is a clear definition of the functions of the board and the functions of management. That's why we say the board supervises and guides, management executes. So I think I'm answering the question, but we can go into more detail towards the end of the session when we go into the questions and answers. But I think that's my answer to the question. Thank you, Magdalena. And it's very important what you're mentioning because within the context of these social corporations, since we think that since there's no owner, there's no uh, seeking a return of investment, uh, we still need to have a board of directors that oversees and makes sure that there is a maximum return, which is a social return, a return of impact. So it's the appropriate management of financial and non-financial resources in these type of organizations. So now moving on to Claudia, within that management of resources, the compliance with that mission, that mandate of that mission, there's an important issue, which is the oversight architecture, the control architecture. What can you tell us about this important component of corporate governance? What does an appropriate control structure mean? What does it mean when a nonprofit wants to establish a good control architecture? Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. A pleasure to be here, sharing a on a subject that I'm passionate about, like everybody here, which is corporate governance. There's always going to be a lot to talk about, a lot to share. Now, going to the question that you are asking, well, a control architecture. That's one of basic elements when we talk about corporate governance, corporate government. Of course, I want to emphasize what Santiago mentioned a few minutes ago, talking about the tone of commitment at the highest level, the commitment to implement that corporate governance in an institution. But that commitment needs to have some shape through that control structure. Having controls, procedures, a appropriate risk management to see where those are for the organization. What that does is make sure that the organization is managed in the right way, that all the necessary procedures are in place to make sure that the goals are being met, that rules are being followed, that conflicts of interest are being avoided, that the resources received are being used in the right way, depending on the social objectives of the organization. I mean, we can have the best possible will, we can have a lot of commitment, but that commitment needs a structure. And that's really important because we don't all think the same way. And what we might think is right might not seem so to other people. So that's why it's important that we have a consensus on how things are to be done in the right way in the organization, how we achieve transparency, which is an essential element of good corporate governance, and how there's an objective look on processes. So a control structure is like the engine, so that all of these good decisions of corporate governments, all of this commitment at the highest level is reflected in the corporation, and that it can be verified, that can be validated, that we can be sure that it's not just words, but that they're part of the organization. Now, how much control? That has to be proportional or an agreement with the organization. Like Santiago was saying, flexibility and a balance between what I'm trying to achieve, the cost that it entails, and the size of the organization. We don't need to have a structure in which nothing can be done without following a procedure, but we need to look at the risks. Where are the risks, and where do we need to have these checks to make sure that the organization is being handled well? And we need to be completely transparent in the way we're managing the company, the corporation. I think that answers the question, right? Yes, yes, of course. You mentioned an essential component, and with that emphasis on risk management, which in some cases allows us to preserve value, in other cases to generate value. And that's an important element for any type of organization. We have covered issues like the board of directors. We've talked about this all this control environment, that general definition of good government, good governance. But Roxana, if we could, since you have that rich experience in the public sector, the private sector, academia, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the importance of transparency and the disclosure of information as a practice of good governance. How important is transparency for accountability and mainly to build a reputation?
The microphone. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, both of you. And just like my colleagues, I would like to start by thank you so much for this invitation. This is for me an incredible pride, and it's an honor to be here sharing ideas about these very interesting topics with you, particularly with the GFN. My heart is here with you. And so we continue with the same very important topic, and for good performance of all organizations in civil society. I think that accountability and transparency are something that is fundamental, both from the ethical standpoint and also from the administrative standpoint, so that it can support the good performance of our organizations. So I relate just thinking of the accountability and transparency issues. I think of the people, stakeholders, the groups that we are accountable to. We have to remember them because we are talking mostly about a communication process here. So that is what leads us to really place those people, everybody that's involved, ahead of everybody. We need to think of consumers, the government agencies, the public at large. Communication is always going to be fundamental. So I think of accountability and transparency not only as it relates to the things I already mentioned. Alejandra, you were talking about positioning the company, establishing trust. We need to be very clear with all these different audiences. I also related to something else, which is the typical aspect, is the regulatory aspect. You have to follow the rules, you have to follow the norms. But I also add to this the idea that accountability and transparency are also associated to your own self-assessment, how you assess the way that you perform. I think for me this is like a triangle. Everything connects these things together. And looking at this from this perspective, and that is my own area, we talk about the 5 E's that we need to take care of: efficiency, uh, efficiency, effectiveness, because I'm trying to achieve certain goals, efficacy, effectiveness. And, I was talking about that before in one of the other interventions. Also, ethics. And in this case, I would say aesthetics too, the way things look. Through transparency, we want to create trust. And at the same time, I want to inspire, particularly in our case, speaking about the civil society, we want to talk about food banks. We need the support of so many actors, so many people. So we want this accountability, this transparency, to use this as a mechanism to invite and to convince people to join our cause. So that's why we have to be very clear in what we're trying to achieve. That's why we have to pay attention to the impact that we have on the different places where we function and act. And we really need to think of this, and this is very important. Transparency and accountability are fundamental. Thank you so much, Roxana. So we see that in this first portion of our conversation, we define corporate governance, what it is, and what are the main axes or the main components of what we consider corporate governance. The collective decision-making entities, how we communicate information, the management architecture. Roxana, we'll continue with you. Many times corporate governance, you see it as the one in charge of large companies, public companies, those that have shareholders, formal companies, very professional organizations. So what happens for the social sector or for social organizations? Is it that it doesn't apply as much? But we've seen that good practices when we talk about ethics and transparency and accountability, when we talk about effective use of your resources, and you can see that this applies to any organization. So how do you see this specifically for nonprofit social organizations? Thank you. And well, obviously a little bit of adding to what I just said a minute ago, I would like to share with you that for me this is a fundamental aspect of it. Many times in the civil society organizations or nonprofit organizations, maybe we've been slow to join this movement, to go to more effective ways of organizing ourselves. But from the standpoint of having an impact and achievements, sometimes it makes me sad that I think that in the private sector they're so organized because their goals are very clear. Of course, I mean they want to be profitable, they want to make money, and for us in the social sector, that hasn't been that clear. We are trying to create wellness. We are generating value for our society. Is different. So we really need to wear the same shirt. We need to do this right. We need to do this very well. And in that regard, we have to realize that, like I said from the very beginning, uh, we have of course it has to do with the size of the organization, it has to do with other things, but we need to organize our own corporate governance, and we need to also reflect the level of maturity that the organization has, and we need to be very aware that just like in the private sector, there are very important challenges. There is a lot of pressure that forces people to do what they have to do when they make the effort to be organized. The same thing should happen in the social sector. We have huge challenges. The first challenge, because of the pressing situation, we have to be able to manage our resources right. So, how do we ensure that these resources that are so hard to get, sometimes they are so scarce, and we have to fight so much to get them. Everybody's competing for the same resources among the different projects, and we do get some support from the public sector. So how do we make sure that they are channeled in the right direction, that they are used for the best events, for the best activities? So typically we are very restricted, at least in Mexico, on how we are able to use our resources. So this is a very important issue. This is something that we need to look at from the corporate government. And some other elements that you mentioned a minute ago, I do not want to repeat things, But leadership is also fundamental here. The fact that we should be able to guarantee how we're organizing our impact, how we how do we implement our work so that we show what benefits we provide, so that we prove the value of what we do, so we can feel the needs that we see. So we have to do this with a lot of effectiveness. That's what I was saying earlier today. I do not want to generate any kind of productive results as part of what we're doing, and that is something that we need to do. We need to assess everything we do, and I'm sure that everybody else has something else to contribute to this too. Thank you so much, Rosanna. Thank you so much. First of all, because you do open up the issue of leadership, and that's very important. We're going to talk about that. The other thing is you mentioned the importance of, again, efficient use of resources. In the private sector, they are organized and they can do it, and we have an even bigger responsibility. And the issue is in nonprofit societies, organizations, we are organized, we are motivated to do things right. That is the reason we exist. But the question is, in that context, is it necessary to have that control, that regulation? And Claudia, you mentioned in your prior answer, you talked about the risks and the controlling architecture and the importance that this has. But how about nonprofit organizations? Are they vulnerable to corruption? Do we need the same kind of controls and regulations? Oh, yes, even more so. I think that even more so, a nonprofit organization needs this, because all the work that you invested so much time and effort in doing, if we do not know clearly where the resources are coming from, we can really destroy all the efforts. We have a beautiful goal, but maybe inefficiency will kill our work. So we need to do it. We need to do it with regulations, and we need to, for instance, I'm going to give you an example. In 95, after a devastating earthquake that destroyed Kobe in Japan, one of the nonprofits stopped what they were doing, and they started organizing and helping people faster than the government. And now more recently in 2011 with the tsunami and the earthquake, uh, I'm sorry, that there was a corrupt organization, a mafia in Japan that started organizing faster than everybody else. And I've seen that in Colombia. Some of the cartels built like a whole neighborhood, and they did it with little resources, with soccer fields, and with sanitary systems. Al Capone in the U.S. During the Depression of the 30s, he was the first one that opened up public kitchens for people, or soup kitchens for people to eat at. So the question is, what is the cost? Does it matter where the funds are coming from? Does it matter whether the funds are tainted with blood, whether they're corrupt? So we are now facing a situation, and when we're facing a situation, we have to be very firm. We have to maintain our values, but we have to be very aware of all the risks that we're facing. Third parties can maybe channel illicit funds to respond to these needs. And maybe tomorrow, these people will be able to destroy these incredible efforts that we're making to be able to do our job, to reach our goals, and to provide a social benefit. And so, going back to what your question is, it is, of course, much more important for us in the nonprofit sector to have all these controls, to have all these regulations, this know your client, know exactly where the resources are coming from, and to be certain that the resources that you're using are legal, are licit, and that is very important for the organization. Thank you so much. And you're showing us examples that show very clearly that this can happen, and that social organizations are not immune to this type of event. And that's why the control architecture becomes so important. I remember when Katrina hit, And of course, everybody was called to action. And we were able to trace over 2,000 fraudulent sites online that were trying to gather funds. And of course, I mean, it was fraudulent. So we need to take this into account, and we need to repeat again. Not only you need to have the process and procedures implemented, but you have to have the values, because at the end of the day, human beings are the ones that make decisions, and the social organizations depend on donations, and they also need to create this level of trust and this reputation in how they handle their resources. So the control architecture is very important. So we are going to go to Magdalena now. Magdalena, you mentioned um, the issue of the board of directors, that like the center of where decisions are made, where power is centered, and it serves not only in an advisory role but also in a supervision role. We not only need to do things right, we need to do them very well. And these roles are usually in the board of directors, and the same thing should happen in a social nonprofit organizations. The short answer is, of course, absolutely, yes, because the institutions, nonprofit institutions, have to have a board of directors that, again, supervises, that maximizes how we use resources. Resources are scarce everywhere, also in the private sector, even more scarce. Um, it's really hard to get them in nonprofit organizations. So we have to be more responsible, and we have to maximize, resources. And what we said before, not necessarily, how it flows through the company dividends and all that, but you need to make sure that you achieve success in whatever mission the organization has. But that is what the donor is going to be looking at, whether it's a corporate donor, a personal donor. And I connect this to what Claudia mentioned, to you have to know who is giving you the funds.
So again, very clearly, the board fulfills the same function in nonprofits, which is to oversee, to control, and it has to respond to the interests or of all the stakeholders. Because donors are sometimes considered like, well, they're donating money, that's it. But no, there has to be an accountability and mainly the responsibility over those resources that have been provided for a specific mission. So again, this is basic because here the agency issue that I mentioned before can occur. The fact that the objective is not to maximize profit doesn't mean that there are not going to be any problems. Not because it's a non-profit with a very altruistic purpose, everything will work fine, because we're still human beings who can make mistakes. Those mistakes can be intentional, like the fraud you were mentioning. You were talking about the when when you Magdalena, you mentioned Katrina, over 2,000 websites asking for funds, but there can be an abuse of trust, using assets of the organization for personal benefit, and sometimes it cannot may not be intentional. It can be because of lack of knowledge, and also the agency can operate in a negligent fashion, not intentionally, but also because of lack of knowledge. So these are also pretty special boards of directors because there are different motivations to join a board in a nonprofit. I'm not going to go in very much detail, but there's basically four basic motivations. One is social, my friends are there, or colleagues from college, from university, or I want to work there for my own personal development. I want to learn something that from what this organization does. Or it could be a material motivation. This can, be beneficial for my own private business and whatever industry, or maybe I'm aligned with the objectives of the organization, like the food bank. Ideologically, I'm in alignment with their work. So those are the motivations, and I'll tell you later while I'm mentioning those motivations. However, the question was if they should fulfill the same tasks. Yes, of course, but there's two angles. One is what it should be. The other thing is what it's going to become in practice. So the board of directors, of course, has to be an advisory board, has to advise, has to control, to oversee the organization. In fact, it has to designate directors or general managers. But in practice, we see, and this is a constant in the whole region, sometimes the board members assume the position that they are doing us a favor. Just the fact that I'm here, I'm sitting here, I'm making the world a better place, and that's enough. So there's not you don't see the right level of involvement. And then what happens is that you see uh, great issues, big issues with corporate governance because the director maybe will be chasing after all the other board members to get the advice they need, etc. Or maybe they get tired and they try to concentrate all power in themselves and try to do everything. And that concentration of power has two consequences that can be pretty negative. It breaks that balance of powers because that's why you have, a board of directors and general management, and also the board of directors loses that uh, task of being an advisory board. So we end up with grave issues in the way it functions because of that attitude of, I'm doing you a favor. Thanks, Maggie. That's really important so that that governance works well at the organizational level. So with that separation of functions, let's say you have management comes up with a strategic plan. They discuss it with the board. The board validates that plan, goes back to management to be executed. Then it goes back to the board to review its implementation. There's KPIs, etc. So that would be ideal. But for that, we need the board and management to understand clearly what their roles are and to be really committed to fulfilling those roles seriously. And there's a very big issue in nonprofits. If I, as a member of the board, I don't fulfill my role, I don't recognize my role, then that creates imbalances in the whole organization. Um, yeah, we were talking about leadership. We would like to go to Santiago now to discuss the issue of leadership in nonprofits. I mean, leadership, it's always difficult in any type of organization. Let's talk about a family, for example, it's pretty complex. But in nonprofits, where you have maybe somebody who's been there since the founding of the organization, and that's very important. And that person becomes with a very special role and powerful role, and sometimes they get entrenched in those positions for many years, for better or for worse. So in nonprofits, is there any special considerations, Santiago? Well, I would like to first of all talk about some issues related to, you mentioned succession. Succession means, and it can imply many things, like, for example, in a state succession, a person has to die, so there is a change. But when we have a founder of those organizations, what are the risks? We find what's called the key person risk. That person who was a fountain of knowledge within the company, the person who knows the history of the organization, person who has helped that organization to develop, to grow. And it's very important to understand that when we talk about a succession, we have to break that myth, demolish that myth that says that the person has to die or retire so there's a succession. So by by planning succession, that means developing a number of processes that provide also for a long-term vision. There's some key points here. It's not just knowledge, as I mentioned. In general, all organizations, profit and non-profit, have a culture. And these are the persons that create that culture of the company. You use the word getting entrenched. That's a harsh word because that person sometimes can generate a very good culture for the company. And if that person is so great for the company, I would like for them to stay there for 30 years. But you have to be prepared for risks. What happens if something happens to that person, or if that person is not following the management practices that are needed maybe for the entity, for the institution, or what happens, for example, if they cannot keep the commitment to the different stakeholders, the different interest groups in that environment. So I'm very interested in that aspect, establishing a succession plan, knowing what would be the steps to follow if somebody has to succeed that person. Succession, that doesn't mean you're planning already on removing that person. Maybe that's the first myth that we have to get rid of. When you're planning for succession, that doesn't mean you want to get rid of a person. You're just mitigating the risks of when the time comes and that person is not there, and if that can affect the organization. So there's internal aspects and external aspects. Internal, because a succession plan needs to help the organization to eliminate some uh, disloyalty that might exist, or conflicts of interest within the organization. And also, it provides some clarity about the career, the professional career of that person within the organization. Uh, so internally, it helps to create some order. Now, externally, it's also very important because it allows you to, first of all, establish a culture, as I said, and also the loyalty to different groups that are connected or linked to the organization. A lot of groups linked to the organization because of that person. Now, if that entity is not going to have an impact, then that loyalty becomes loyalty to the person and not to the entity itself. So planning a succession means doesn't mean you're going to remove that person. It means mitigating risks. Again, and to close, there was a very interesting study in which 10 people were asked to to solve a problem as if they were Wall Street brokers. And the other 10, another 10 group of 10 people was asked to solve the problem as members of the community. The Wall Street people all had different solutions. They were fighting amongst themselves. People who were asked to solve it from the community standpoint, they came back with a response that they had all come to a consensus about. So that tells you about the culture of an organization. So the leader is the one who determines the culture, and to mitigate risks, that's why you need a succession plan.
Muy bien, Santiago. Muchísimas gracias.
Okay,
Quedamos claro las
thank you,
diferencias
Santiago. Very clear.
en general.
Now,
Y
talking about
cuéntame un poco de tu
succession,
experiencia
not
como
just in
persona
leadership, but
que ha
also
tomado
a
sus
technical
laborales para ver el
succession,
crecimiento desde el punto
so
de vista
that
profesional y en
collaborators
función también de la
know that there
conocimiento
is
de
a
áreas importantes
professional growth,
cuando
and
estamos trabajando también
managing
en
that
equipos
knowledge is
en
important when we
organizaciones.
know it's a very
Vamos
important
entonces
intangible
a
asset
continuar con la
in these
conversación.
social
Roxana,
corporations. So
nos gustaría
let's
saber,
continue the conversation.
sobre todo para
Roxana,
estos
we would
miércoles,
like
esta
to
dinámica
know,
que hoy
mainly
estamos
for
escuchando,
these
que se está
board
generando dentro
members
de la
who
audiencia,
are
¿cuáles
hearing
son
us
esos
today, who are
retos
listening, who are
a
part
los
of the
que
audience,
siempre el
what are
funcionario
those
recibe en
the
cualquier tipo de
challenges,
organización,
the main
digamos
challenges?
cierto
We
estatus,
know that
pero a la
being a
vez
board member in any type of
comienza a
organization
darles
confers
desafíos diferentes.
some
¿Cuáles son esos
status,
desafíos y
but
responsabilidades que debe
also
considerar un
uh,
representante cuando decide
creates
tomar
responsibilities.
ese
So,
tipo
what
de
are those
decisión?
responsibilities that a prospective board member needs
Gracias.
to consider when they're
Yo
thinking about
pienso que
joining this type of organization?
estamos
Thank you
haciendo
very much. I think we
muchas
are
cosas.
referring to
Uno de
different
ellos
things.
es
On one hand,
que pues como organización
challenges
tiene que
to
atender
the
de
extent
manera
that they're
decidida
those
ante
challenges that have to be
como que
faced
para mí un
uh,
reto es, ay,
with
¿sabe? Como que
firmly. But also,
como
there's a challenge of
suena
something that needs to be achieved. It's like an invitation to make an effort on something, and that's the sense in which I would like to share with you. I think on one hand, there's the issue of commitment,
para mí
and
ese
it's
es el
been
tema central.
mentioned, it's been discussed,
No
and that's the
asistir a una
central issue.
conferencia, a unos
Not
consejos o juntas
uh,
directivas,
joining
nunca
a board just to see, well, let's see if I can help. I think the main thing is that we have to go in with a lot of energy. So the challenge is saving the world. Okay, so the strategy needs to start there. We need to have there's a great need to commit. And if we look in a simplistic way at the board has is in charge of strategic direction, also financial and operational oversight, and another task would be positioning itself, creating that trust so that our organization can achieve all its goals. So that's another challenge then for the board members is to have a lot of clarity, both from a legal and regulatory standpoint. What are the ways this type of organization needs to operate? I imagine that, like in Mexico, other countries have a number of legal requirements, regulatory requirements, not just from the state, from government, but also from the standpoint of our donors. What are the requirements? How do we need to operate, etc. And also getting organized. This concept of succession was mentioned and discussed. And I see that linked to the organization of the board itself. How do we determine who belongs, who doesn't belong? If we're already at the stage where we have determined that board members will serve for certain periods, well, we have to have a very clear definition of what type of people we require, what type of work needs to be done, what is really an asset for the organization. And an important issue in relation to leadership and a strategic vision, it has to do with the five S's in Spanish, or five E's: efficiency, uh, effectiveness, ethics, aesthetics. And as far as uh, effectiveness, we have to look beyond our own objectives. What I have seen very often, more often than I would like to, is that sometimes a situation with board members is that we fall into what's called micromanagement, getting to work at very specific uh, levels of the organization and losing sight of the big picture. So it's important to know the organization, to know the limitations, the protocols to operate. And I would again emphasize the issue of commitment, the big commitment that this represents, and that needs to be undertaken with a lot of energy.
Listo, entonces, muchas gracias Rosana por
Thank you so
resaltar.
much, Rosanna, for highlighting these very important issues.
Nos quedan
And
tres minutos que vamos a
we have
dedicar esta
three
vez
questions
para
on
Santiago, Magdalena
our
y
side,
después
Santiago, Claudio,
Claudio
Magdalena, and then we're
para
going
que
to move on
todos
to
tengan tiempo de interactuar
the
con ellos
questions
también.
the audience has so that you have time to talk to them too.
Considera que la
Santiago,
transparencia
do
puede
you
constituir
consider
un rol en la
transparency
consecución de
can
resultados
fulfill a
y
role
alcanzar
so
la
that you can get
efectividad del gobierno?
resources for the
Pues
organization to
como
achieve their
antes
goals?
Roxana nos dio una
What I
definición
mean
de
is,
transparencia,
Roxana gave us a lesson on the importance of transparency and that it is your duty and your responsibility as a nonprofit organization to have that. Can we use this as a strategy to get resources as well? Yes, yes, I totally agree. I agree with everything Roxana said, of course, and I know that it is your duty. And I also think it's very important, and you have to be transparent because of the effect this has. And something that was mentioned that was very interesting, one of the things that were said before, the exposure these nonprofit organizations have. I compare that to, a public company, a state company, and their exposure. There is a higher expectation for these enterprises or these companies, and they have to have a higher level of transparency and responsibility. So this is very important, not only because of what food banks contribute to society, but this is very important because of the people that are going to finance their operations. So we need to understand transparency at two separate levels. We have active transparency and passive transparency. Active is what I can show as an entity, what I can demonstrate. And it's very important to understand that transparency has to be on time, brief, precise. We need to avoid noise as much as we can. Why? Because this is something that reflects on what we're talking about. Being transparent avoids fraud, for instance. When we're talking about COVID, for instance, where food banks became like the first line of defense, uh, fighting the pandemic, this very tragic pandemic that we're all facing. So it's very important to be able to demonstrate how we're using the resources. But then you can go beyond that and you can understand this as a key element, something that shows how these entities prove how important they are. Environmental social governance is what matters here. The AGS, that is
Si uno
sustainability itself. If we think, for instance, of the Sustainable Development Goals, both 2 and 12, and 12 that has to do with production, responsible production and consumption. So if we can be transparent, if we can be clear on how we handle our business, how we manage beneficiaries, how we manage resources, this allows us to create a virtuous circle so that we can get more support. And I think that something that I wanted to mention, something that Roxana mentioned that I thought was phenomenal, the fact that we need to inspire. You are a network, and when you can inspire another part of this network, that is one of the key aspects where transparency and communication is basic and very important. Obviously, you're also exposed, like Claudia mentioned in one of her answers. You do have high risk exposure at the same time. You take food, you receive food rescue, you get products, you get things from producers, from supermarkets, from donations. So you have the public eye on you because you are receiving these products, this food, but there is also a risk in terms of the quality of the products that you receive, how you use these products, how big the impact is that you have on society. So I believe that this is very important, and this shows you the importance of transparency. And you have to remember the private sector also serves a role. And they also have the environment, government, and society. They also serve a role in all three areas. And many times you can find in food banks an element so that they can channel uh, their resources that way. So private companies, corporations look for food banks so that they can achieve their own social objectives. Very good. So environment, government, and society. So food banks as a way of channeling these social obligations and these resources. So Claudia, we were talking about boards of directors, we were talking about transparency, we were talking about control. We don't want to neglect the meetings. When you have social institutions, you don't have owners, but you do have stakeholders. You have those people that uh, support the existence of these organizations. But when you have these board meetings, the role of the stakeholders sometimes disappears. You can't see it. So, what are what are we supposed to see within this context of good practices, good governance practices? I understand the question, and I think that when we are facing uh, an association where you don't have any owners, where you don't have shareholders, the responsibility is even higher compared to a company where the only thing that I'm risking is my own investment. So if I lose money, it's my own money. But here, the board meetings play an essential role. You have to make sure that we are meeting the goals that the organization was created to meet. And something that is very clear, a meeting on paper is not good corporate governance. That is not even an issue. You should not just circulate meeting records or minutes. No, there needs to be a real discussion. There needs to be a real meeting. Just the circulation of minutes and a presentation is not enough. Just the opposite. It works against transparency. And when you are looking at a corporation, you have the names of the shareholders and the board members, and that is how you guarantee how the company is using their resources and how it's working to meet their goals. So we really need to make sure that the enterprise is working appropriately, not just names on a piece of paper, not just signature, not just minutes. It needs to go beyond that. So what we're looking for is we need to have this space. This meeting has to work so that we can achieve the goals, that you have to review everything that has been done. And it needs to be done, from the board of directors meeting. Everybody has to be accountable even before the meeting. And we need to make sure that these meetings really supervise, that they review and that they supervise everything that is happening, that we need to make sure the information is accurate. We need to make sure that the decisions are made and that the board members are meeting their goals and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And there is no other institution, no other entity that can really decide for them, because that board is the one that needs to do their job and is the one that adds value to the organization. So should never have a paper meeting. We should never, I mean, that there's zero transparency and zero accountability when you do that. Everybody from their own job has to do what they're supposed to do. You do not assume somebody else's functions, but their own role. Even if they meet once a year, they need to meet once a year, and they need to do it with responsibility, and they need to do it putting all the necessary effort
Muy
into
bien,
it.
muy bien. Muchas
Very good,
gracias.
very good.
Claro,
Thank you.
eso es
Claudia,
importante
that's
y muy buena idea.
corporate paper governance is not
Definitivamente, o sea,
governance,
reunirnos
obviously.
las
In
diferentes
fact,
organizaciones, los
the
órganos de
different
gobierno están
organizations,
constituidos por alguna razón
the
y
governance
requieren que ejerzan
uh,
efectivamente su rol.
entities exist
Y
for a
eso es
reason, and we need to make
importante
sure they
porque
fulfill their role.
se alinean.
And we're
Entonces,
going to
quería
questions from the audience.
aprovechar esa experiencia que tú tienes como
Magdalena, why
representante
don't
sindical,
you
¿qué tan
use your
importante crees tú que es el
experience
registro y
to
cómo
tell us
puede
how
contribuir
important
a que
is
esta
it
gente
to
tome una decisión?
have a
Esto en el
registry
contexto
of
de
financial
un inversionista privado.
resources? This is important for for a private company,
Diferentes tipos de causas.
but
¿Qué tan
the World
importante
Bank
crees tú
supports a
que
lot
es
of the causes that you're working on.
internalizar el
So
control de
how
recursos
important is it for
para
you
poder
to
contribuir a
have
esta
an accurate listing of resources and how you use them? This is a fundamental issue because everything that we mentioned earlier today in terms of transparency, control, and it is fundamental also because you have to create an environment of trust in the organization. So if you do not have control of the financial activities, if you if you don't have an accounting of what you're doing with the resources, it's a problem. But I wanted to clean it up. We were talking about enthusiasm that you have to have. We have to have enthusiasm. The people who get involved in nonprofit organizations have this enthusiasm, and this enthusiasm that is really good and really positive, but in itself sometimes it leads to these entities that are formed mostly by specialists. Maybe you decide, well, this job and that job is not that important, so why don't we subcontract it? For instance, legal issues. Why don't we just give this responsibility to, I don't know, a group of lawyers? Maybe the cost is going to be lower, it's going to be cheaper. So the same thing with accounting. If you get somebody else to do the accounting for you, it may be a problem. Of course, it depends on the size of the organization and the sophistication. So some entities may not need to do it themselves, but it's fundamental that you do so that you avoid negligence or not using your resources the best way possible. But sometimes when you're looking for specialists in all areas, you sort of lose your ability to manage what you're doing. So when there is no balance between administration and achieving your goals, these areas such as accounting or balance sheets or even legal issues, the institution may suffer, the donors may suffer because you lose trust, because you don't know. I don't have any proof of how well the resources are being used. These resources I'm providing to you. And as an institution, we may lose resources that way too. So we need to be very careful on this important area, the internal accounting. Sometimes that is contracted to somebody else, and this could harm the institution. It has an impact on the work the board of directors is supposed to do. And as you know, it's really important to have good accounting as part of the company. And also it affects the management of the company, how to organize the use of those resources. We're not talking about working in bad faith here, not at all. We're talking about the fact that um, these people may be experts in accounting or bookkeeping, but they're not experts in what we do. So you have to have the right people that are part of your organization. If I need accountants, I need to have somebody that knows the institution of what we're doing. So in this regard, it's really important so that we can work on trust. If I have, good accountability of all the resources that were donated to us. Maybe the World Bank is doing the supervision so that you can really trust that things are being done right. If the home office is 2,000 kilometers away, they can still say, well, I know this partner is doing their job, and because I trust them, we can continue with this support. So please have the appropriate bookkeeping. Please have the appropriate audits of your books, and maybe you can get an agreement with one of the big four. It doesn't. It can be a creative agreement, but that is very very important, and you really have to follow these two areas: audits and accounting.
Súper, muy bien, Magdalena. Entonces, esta
Very good, Magdalena. Okay, we're starting to get some questions from the audience. Very interesting questions.
planteaste la necesidad de
Roxana,
establecer y tener en
you
cuenta
talked about the
eficiencia,
need of
eficiencia, eficacia
establishing and having all the
y
five
eficiencia.
E's in
Me
mind:
llamó la atención del público. Nos
efficiency,
preguntan
efficacy, aesthetics,
ante esa
or
necesidad
yeah.
de
Mhm.
definir esas 5 E's
So,
en la gestión de los bancos
faced with the need of having
¿por
those
cuál de
five
ellas comenzar?
E's
¿Existiría
uh,
en este caso un
in
orden
food banks, which one do we
primero
start with?
cuál
Would
sería?
there be a specific order if you could prioritize them? How would that go? Thank you very much. Honestly, more than a hierarchy or an order, I would like to emphasize that we're talking about issues. This is my area, the systemic part. We uh, relate that to a KPI. So I have to understand efficiency in the sense that how do I best manage my resources? Efficacy relates to how I am achieving the objectives, if I'm achieving the objectives I want to, the reach of the food assistance, etc., and effectiveness. Well, it's questioning myself. Well, what is this good for? This objective, I'm assisting so many people, I'm improving this. How is this contributing to the quality of life of these people? Or are people becoming dependent on the bank? So effectiveness goes beyond the objectives, is what we call the super system, the above the system, the global uh, um, picture. And the next one is who am I affecting with my activity? What are the secondary or negative adverse effects of my activity? And then the other thing is I'm talking about the satisfaction, in particular with that sense of inspiration that I was talking about. What I'm doing, does it motivate people? Does it inspire people? Does it generate that satisfaction of having achieved something that I like, that makes sense, that I enjoy, that I no needs to be done. So to that extent, more than talking about priorities or hierarchy, I would invite boards of directors to think about all these different contexts, what strategies, what activities from my organization relate to what specific KPIs. It's not just a philosophical discourse. Of course, you have to be uh, very specific. You have to evaluate impacts. You do tax analysis, fiscal analysis, public, the number of volunteers, etc. So that would be my answer. So it's more than just establishing priorities. Okay, thanks, Roxana. We're in the last 15 minutes here, so we will keep asking you questions. And if you can uh, give us the most specific, concrete answers you can so that we can cover all the questions. Santiago, in the US, we have the National Association of Corporate Directors. Is there in Latin America an association that where we can keep updating on all these subjects? Yes, I think in several countries you will find institutions similar to that national association. For example, this discussion is supported by CESA. CESA is part of something that's called the Colombian Institute of Corporate Governance. That's an institution in Colombia. But if you go to all the countries, you're going to find different entities. Sometimes they're called centers for corporate governance, sometimes institute for directors of boards or board directors or corporate governance. You can ask Maggie about institutions in Chile. There are three or four. I'm in charge of the Center for Corporate Governance at the University of San Andres in Argentina, but there are others. In Mexico, there is the Anahuac Center. So yes, the, on the issue of nonprofits, this has been studied in detail, but the IBGC, the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance. If you can read Portuñol, you can go to Portuguese. You can go to the IBGC page, and they also work within a network that's called ICLA. There's a coordination. If you ask one of them, all those entities can ask the others. Good. So we can see the creation of those nodes and those systems in relation to corporate governance, not only uh, nationally, but at the regional level. And with Ana Catalina Suarez, we are coordinating for the for GFN, uh, a like a network of allies or on this issue of corporate governance. So you can ask Ana Catalina. Claudia, you talked about an environment or structure, a control structure. Usually, when we talk about control or oversight structure, that's seen usually as an area of the same organization. If they do audits, that's control. The board of directors can be seen as that, or it can be done with independent organization, external organizations, always, of course, looking at the cost benefit ratio. So what would be the best bet? Well, actually, it's a combination of several things. When we talked about control or oversight architecture, whether there is or not an internal organization for this, it's taking making decisions control that very often come from the financial area and that needs to be implemented. The audit area is not going to implement the controls. That has to come from management. The audit area, internal audits, will verify that those controls are working. And very often they work on improvement plans. They challenge different areas of the organization to improve their controls, their procedures, and the coordination with an external audit area that's looking from the outside, just making sure that this structure is working. Of course, that's the best option. To me, that's the best combination. However, it is true that you cannot have everything within organizations. You have to establish priorities, and sometimes it might be better to have a compliance officer that can produce this control and present challenges. And maybe an external organization. So it depends on the organization, but all you always need to have
Maravilloso,
a
claro.
supervisory
Muchas gracias.
entity or area.
Esta quisiéramos dirigírsela a
Thank you.
Magdalena. ¿Qué tal
We would
si
like to
nos
ask this
ayuda para que
question
entendamos
to Magdalena.
la ingeniería
How
social y gobierno
important
corporativo en
are those
sostenibilidad
trends of the environmental,
en México,
social, and
Magdalena? Y
corporate
así
governance
pues nosotros
for
empezamos
nonprofit organizations?
y a esta hora
We see uh,
trabajando
all
fuertemente
these issues
pues en
of
inversiones en
environmental,
desarrollo
social,
social, en diferentes áreas, todo lo que
responsible
pueda relacionarse
investments.
con
We
medio
see all
ambiente.
this issue resonating in different areas. How do you see this in relation to nonprofits? Yes, and I'm very happy that this is really gaining a lot of strength in Latin America. The Europeans started with this, especially in Germany, and I saw this closely at Siemens. And this, why am I so happy about it? Well, because this is a fundamental issue. It relates to the survival of the organization. Today, for a company to survive, we don't only need to sell a product, but we need to do it in a sustainable way. And what does this mean? It's not a greenwash or having a corporate social responsibility department. It means to have these three issues: environment, society, and corporate governance, something that's at the core of the company and from where the company, a core from where the company develops strategically. And the same occurs with nonprofits. If they don't have that strategic core, if they don't keep into account the issues of social governments, of corporate governance, social, both internal and external. Social internally is all the collaborators, all the partners, and then the external society and environment, not just the surrounding environment, but the environmental impact of the company. Without that, there is no sustainability and there's no long-term survival. So how basic? Yeah, that's critical. It's critical for the survival of the organization. And again, whether it's for profit or not for profit, is not an important distinction because the organization has to survive and survive anyway. Okay, very well. We have a question that we would like for Ana Catalina to answer. Uh, it says, is there any food bank in Latin America that is overseeing its donors, or and how are they doing that, or inspecting its donors?
Hola,
Ana
claro que sí,
Catalina.
tenemos más alimentos
Of
que
course, yes, we have food banks. I wouldn't like to call it fiscalization, or, but on financial issues, we have food banks that have incorporated practices like reviewing their monetary donors, in what's called the Clinton list, a list of companies that have been sanctioned for misuse of funds or mismanagement of funds. So we have food banks that, before authorizing money donations, what they do is they make sure that that donor is not listed on that Clinton list. Or also banks in each one of the countries, they have their methodologies to review the monies coming from companies to make sure they have not been sanctioned in some way. So yes, banks
Muchas
do
gracias,
this type
Catalina.
of
Súper.
review
Santiago,
beforehand. Thank you,
en
Catalina.
esta
Great.
Navidad se va a
Santiago,
comprometer a los
they're
miembros
saying,
de las juntas
could you
directivas
help us
profesionales de las
in
asociaciones para un mejor
seeing
funcionamiento?
how we can
Usted siempre es una persona
get a
ya
better
muy
commitment from
conocida en
board
este juego para
members?
convencerlos
These are people who usually
de
do
este juego que
things
le
pretty
gusta.
well, so it's hard to convince them. Yeah, that's a big issue. You have to make sure that your own board. But I think there's a saying that says that those who tell you something, notify something, they're not being misleading. Uh, so if you decide how the board needs to behave, what are their functions, their roles, if you do that, you're letting them, you're not tricking them, and then you can make them accountable afterwards on how they act. So if I'm a friend of the organization, when you can provide for regulations, have regulations for the board, that's approved by the board itself, and then they commit themselves to follow those regulations. And it's very clear how they need to behave and what's the commitment they need to have. And there's two other important points. First, the composition of the board. Sometimes it's not necessary to have that person who's already committed to 1,000 other activities, but rather to find the person who's really going to contribute. So thinking about the best composition for your board, that's something that's important. And the last point is organizing the board so it becomes efficient in its function, having a very clear agenda, having a clear yearly calendar that allows people to know in advance when they're going to participate, and maybe something that's more advanced once these practices have been implemented to do a self-evaluation, which is important to see how the board is working and what might be challenges,
Rosana,
obstacles
¿tienes
in
por qué
order to
complementar, por
improve.
favor? Y
Roxana, if you
gracias,
can
Santiago.
uh, complement Santiago's response.
I would like to mention a couple of things. One is here in Mexico, at least, something that's happening, and I don't want to use the word forced, but something that's helping us. It's helping the organizations work in these processes to improve the board functions. The donors themselves and the different organizations, foundations, those that support the civil society, they are pushing us to towards that better management or better practices, that formalizing of all the activities that the boards must undertake. And that's where you see this possibility, the idea of having advisors to start visualizing how to involve people with experience. Of course, it has to be the specific experience in corporate governance, but that is one of the drivers, I think. And also, the donors themselves are asking, more and more for this credibility, not only the transparency and the resource management, they're also they're also more demanding of our own internal processes. They want to see what we're doing, and that is what's driving this work that we're doing, professionalizing what we're doing and getting more
Rosana,
specialized in
muchísimas
what we're
gracias.
doing.
Vamos
Roxana, thank you so much.
empezar a hacer el
And
cierre
we're
de este
going
espacio.
to start
Quisiéramos compartir
uh,
este,
doing the wrap up
este
for
slide
today's meeting. I wanted
que
to
resume un
share
poco las
this
discusiones que
slide.
hemos
This
tenido
slide
el día
sort
de
of
hoy.
summarizes the discussions that we've had today. The conversation today evolved around everything that has to do with good corporate governance, every single one of these dimensions that make up this corporate government or governance. So we're talking about the structure and how this board has to work. We are here to advise and to sort of lead, and we we need to be in charge of this organization, this corporate governance entity, and how this work has an impact. It has a social value, it has social returns, and that is really important. We need to know. Like Roxana said, we really need to make a
Excelente.
huge
Control
effort to do
ingeniería
this
porque hay que
right.
internalizar los
And this
procesos
control
y hay que
environment, we need to make
internalizar
sure that we emphasize things
temas
like
de riesgo, pero
accounting,
además contar con un
bookkeeping,
acompañamiento
and
de
not only that, we need to
director,
accompany this with
establecer controles
outside
que puedan ayudar a tener un
uh,
ambiente de control
help.
robusto y
We need to
garantizar un
establish
ambiente de
robust
control
agreements, and we need to guarantee that we're using the resources the best way possible. And we need to remember that the directive, the leaders have to show their commitment to what we're doing, and we need to have a framework that shows what the institution needs to be doing, and we emphasize how this works. And nonprofit companies have this responsibility, not only because of ethical reasons, but also because of how the institution is supposed to work. We need to have transparency, we need to have accountability, we need to demonstrate efficiency, and we need to be organized, and we need to work in the most acceptable manner. And we need to be committed to all the stakeholders And all of that has to do with nonprofit institutions. We need to internalize the expectations around us, and we need to be able to establish a long-term relationship with all the other resources that we have, groups of donors, partners, and in general with all our counterparties, everybody else that we work with. And that commitment that we were talking about, that has to do with leadership, it has to do with culture, it has to do with internalizing. And at the end of the day, it's very important that we need to organize all our leaders and managers so that we're working together. And everything that we consider good government, um, we need to mention two things, and they were part of the conversation today: proportionality and flexibility, in the sense that every entity is different, and these structures had to adjust to this reality. And this is dynamic, this is not static, it changes, and this is something that forces you to prepare. You need to be prepared to respond to all changes. I'm going to give the microphone to Ana Catalina so that she can close for today. Thank you so much for listening to us today.
María, Alexander, gracias infinitas.
Maria Andrea, Alexander, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Santiago, Magdalena, Claudia. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for helping us listen to all these voices. Thank you for this conversation, especially about a topic that sounds so localized, like it would apply to one country or just a corporate group or something that we are not involved in, or that's not something that we do, something that is not relevant to us, but but it is. Thank you so much for helping us with this, and we try to repeat to all our members. The only thing that's going to guarantee that you're going to be there long term is that you have to have a powerful board. You have to have a board that guarantees sustainability, not only financial sustainability, but sustainability in other areas too, and that it creates trust with the organizations that we work with. So if we want to be around for many years, these are institutions that are there to solve hunger. So we have to be there at least as long as we have solved the problem, as we have solved hunger in the world. So that's more of a reason for us to be there in the long term. So I want to thank you so much for this great conversation. This is thank you for everybody. Thank you for putting this topic on the table. Also, a huge thanks to our sponsors for this information space. We have HEB, DLA Piper, Lala Foundation, and all our sponsors. Thanks to them, this event was made possible. And two technical things. Today, you're going to receive an email, one with a link to this recording so that you can share it with other organizations. Maybe your beneficiaries, maybe donors, but first of all, for you to share it with all your members, with all your board members, so that they listen to this conversation. Let's make sure that this conversation today becomes a topic of conversation at your boards for the next 6 months. So that they can talk about their functions, their job controls, everything, how the reporting is done, who the reporting is done to, strategies. Let's talk about this for the next 6 months. And the second thing is we will improve, uh, you know, things as we work on them. So you will receive this email from us, and you can give us your feedback so we can improve too. Tell us what you think we should improve, we should do differently. We're working every day to help you. You are the object of our everything that we do. Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe. Stay at home. Thank you for changing the world. Thank you so much. Uh, we are all working together to change people's lives. Thank you so much.